Every author has a point of view, but an author is demonstrating a bias when they ignore reasonable counter-arguments or distort opposing viewpoints. And so this bias is evident whenever the author is unfair or inaccurate in his presentation. And so that pretty much sums up what a bias is. It's when the author is unfair or inaccurate. So, like I said a minute ago, every author is going to have a point of view, but sometimes an author takes that point of view too far and undermines an opposing argument or is inaccurate in portraying the other argument. And so when that happens, the author is demonstrating a bias. Now, an author may use a bias intentionally or unintentionally, but either way, it should always alert the reader to be skeptical of the argument being made. So that's an important point to make, and an important thing to remember, that an author may promote a bias intentionally or unintentionally. But in the end, it doesn't really matter, because either way, the author is using a bias, and that's something that needs to be corrected. Now, it should be noted that a biased author may still be correct. However, the author will be correct in spite of his or her bias, not because of it. So that's another important thing to remember, that an author may still be correct even if they do have a bias. However, the fact that the author is correct does not justify the use of that bias. Now, many people are familiar with some of the hateful stereotypes of certain ethnic, religious, or cultural groups. And so you're probably familiar with what the idea of a stereotype is, because it's like a bias, except that it is specifically applied to a group or place. And so stereotypes are considered particularly distasteful because they promote negative generalizations. And anytime an author uses a stereotype, it reveals ignorance on their part and a lack of curiosity. So readers should be very suspicious of authors who stereotype. And so again, it reveals ignorance or lack of curiosity. And so again, a stereotype is like a bias, except that it is specifically applied to a group or place. So basically, an author maybe looks at a group of people and sees something that they perceive to most of the time be true or is often true, and they make a generalization and apply it to the whole group. And generally, it's going to be something negative, and so generally, it's something that's hateful towards that group. And it indicates their lack of curiosity. And you want a writer to have curiosity so that they are exploring all sides of an argument. And then again, a bias is when an author ignores reasonable counter-arguments or distorts opposing viewpoints. And because of that, the author ends up being unfair or inaccurate. Circular reasoning is a type of logical fallacy. And a logical fallacy is basically a failure of reasoning. So it's important as a reader to recognize logical fallacies because they diminish the value of the author's message. So since circular reasoning is a type of logical fallacy, we could also call circular reasoning a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we can define it as reasoning that offers no support for assertions other than restating them in different words. So another way to define this is we could say circular arguments refer to themselves as evidence of truth. So if you find an argument that refers to itself as evidence of truth, then you know it's a circular argument. Now, circular reasoning is one of the more difficult logical fallacies to identify because it is typically hidden behind dense language and complicated sentences. Now, a simple example of circular argument is when a person uses a word to define itself. Like right here where it says niceness is the state of being nice. So if you as the reader do not know what the word nice means, then this sentence won't be of very much help to you. Now, right here we have a little bit of a more complicated example, and this is what you are more likely to find in your reading. It says poverty is a problem for society because it creates trouble for people throughout the community. So it is redundant to say that poverty is a problem because it creates trouble. So when an author engages in circular reasoning like this right here, it is either because he or she has not fully thought out the argument or because they cannot come up with any legitimate justifications. An essay where you are asked to compare and contrast is extremely prevalent and very popular, so you're probably going to be asked to write one of these types of essays at some point. So it's important that you are prepared to do that. So look at this example, running and swimming as forms of exercise. So in this example, you'd be asking to compare and contrast running and swimming. So look at running and swimming and talk about how they are alike. That's the compare part of it. And the contrast part is talking about how running and swimming are different. But remember, you're not just talking about running and swimming. You're talking about them as forms of exercise. So think about how running and swimming are similar in terms of exercise and how they are different forms of exercise as well. So there are a few things to remember when writing one of these essays. First, have purpose. Don't just compare and contrast something just to do it. Have some kind of purpose, like that way your reader can determine which is the best form, or sometimes it's to show your reader which is the best choice. Then pick your style. Sometimes you can go back and forth, like you can talk about how running and swimming are alike in this way, and then talk about how they're alike in this way. Or you can just talk about running, keep talking about running, and then talk about swimming. So the choice is talk about running and then swimming, or talk about running and swimming back and forth throughout the entire essay. The choice is yours, just decide which one is most effective. And then finally, derive purpose. Now I know I just put that up there, but it's very important. Don't just write an essay where the reader comes to the end of it wondering why they even read your essay. Give them some kind of purpose to comparing and contrasting the things that you have been talking about through the entire paper. So remember those things, and you'll be on your way to writing a great essay.
Historical context. Historical context can impact literature in a number of ways. The author's writing can be impacted by the historical period during which it was written, or the historical setting of the story. For instance, when Charles Dickens was writing, he was writing during a period where authors were paid by the word, which meant that his novels were very, very long. And that was the result of the time period during which his work was written. He was writing long novels because he knew he would get paid more for every word that he wrote. Dialect is something else you can pay attention to. The dialect could be what the author is used to using in his everyday life, or the dialect could be more related to the historical setting of the story. So dialect is something you want to pay attention to and ask yourself, is this the dialect used during the setting, or is this more of just the author using his own personal dialect that he's used to? Another thing to pay attention to with historical setting is major events that are going on. You want to be familiar with the time period during which a story is set so you can have a better understanding of it. So, one example is the Civil War. During the Civil War, slavery was the normal thing in the South. And whenever the Civil War is over, lots of slaves, or people that used to be slaves, wanted to tell their story. And so what came about were slave narratives. And these painted a picture of what slave life was actually like during that time. It was an actual account from that time period. And it kind of also told the relationship between slaves and slaveholders. So that source of writing is very valuable, and it's become one of the most important literary genres for African American writers. Today, people may still write from that perspective in that time period, but the actual slave narratives that gave first-hand accounts were very important. Another thing to pay attention to with Civil War writing, slave narratives, anything from that time period are the themes. A lot of times you'll see themes of power, race, inequality. Because when slavery ended, it was because people were saying, your skin color doesn't make you more or less of a person or a better or worse person. Everyone's equal. And while equal rights didn't come about till later, it started that theme of equality around the Civil War time. Another major event that's common is World War II. There are countless novels based around World War II events, whether it's based in Nazi Germany, whether it's based in America, as people are dealing with what was going on here. But one of the biggest things that you'll see is the topic of genocide, destroying a whole race. So your Jewish Nazi relations, you're going to see a lot of. Anne Frank, very, very popular book, one that most people are going to know about, was based on this. And if you know the World War II era, then you know what to expect when you're reading. You know that the Nazis are trying to take over most of Europe. You know that the Jews are being persecuted, and you've already got that bit of background knowledge before you even read the rest of the book. And with World War II novels, you're again going to see themes of race, power, and democracy, because in the end, people were going to say that having a government where some totalitarian dictator took over everything wasn't the best way to be. And you're going to see people highlighting the pros of democracy. So whenever you're reading, really pay attention to the historical context of the story, because the historical period during which it was written is always going to have an impact, and the historical setting is going to be very important for you to understand, so that you can understand why the author gave the character certain motivations and why the author carried out the plot as they did. Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that all the basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, that one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate, but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Persuasive essays. When writing a persuasive essay, the writer will try to convince the reader to adopt the opinion of the writer on a particular issue. They do this in many different ways. but they should demonstrate a keen understanding of their audience. You need to know who you're writing to, who you're trying to convince of this opinion. Consider the interests, prior knowledge, and learning styles of the audience. So think about who you're writing to. Are they going to be interested in this topic to start with, or are you going to have to get them interested? Are they going to have any prior knowledge about this, or is this the first time they're going to be reading about it? How do they learn? What's the best way that you could support your thesis so that they would eventually adopt your opinion? These are all things to think about when you're writing. At the beginning of every essay, you're going to want to develop your thesis. Now, the thesis is going to be in the introduction of your persuasive essay, but it's going to be at the end, not at the beginning. So in most papers, your thesis will be at the beginning of that introductory paragraph, but not in a persuasive essay, because in a persuasive essay, you want to establish credibility first. You want to win the trust of the audience, or at least their interest, before you tell them what you're trying to convince them of. And one way to do this is to use an anecdote or story. If you start off your paper with a short anecdote or story, it kind of warms the audience to you. You may give them a little bit more information that lets them know you are a credible source to be talking about this topic, and then introduce your thesis. Then introduce what it is you're going to be trying to convince them of in this persuasive essay. Now, once you've established your thesis, there are several ways that you can develop it, but we're going to discuss 3 different persuasive essay techniques today. One is making claims. You're going to give lots of supporting ideas to your main argument, so you should have small claims along the way that support the central argument. You make one big claim at the beginning when you tell people what it is you're writing about, what it is you're trying to convince them of, but you're going to make several small claims along the way that support that central argument. Claims should be rooted in fact and observation. These claims cannot be something that is just your opinion. It can't be something you made up. You can't say, I think chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream. You could say, I think an ice cream parlor should serve more varieties of chocolate ice cream. And you could back that up by going and doing some research, looking to see what kind of money the store might make if they had different ice cream flavors. And you could back it up. There's facts, there's observations, there's statistics you could look at. But if you just say, chocolate's the best, there should be more chocolate, that's just your opinion. It's not a small claim that would be confirmable. And that leads us to this part. Must be confirmed. Any facts that you include, any observations must be confirmable. You must be able to go back and show where you found them, show that it's a true statement. So, with any persuasive essay, include references when possible. Show where you got this information. Don't make the reader go find it. Present it to them to show that you are being upfront about this. What you're saying is true. What you're saying is the right thing, and they should believe you. It further establishes trust with them. Another way that you can develop your thesis is with examples and expert opinions. Examples are most effective when they complement facts. So you've laid out some facts and observations. Now give some examples that support those, because examples are a good way to make dry facts more interesting or understandable. Sometimes a writer will present a fact and you'll say, I don't really know what they mean by that. But if they give you an example to back it up, then you say, oh, that's what they meant. So using an example can make your audience understand what you're trying to tell them better and make it more interesting, because sometimes facts are dry and hearing a lot of facts in a row may just be boring and may not actually pull your reader's interest toward that opinion you're trying to convince them of. If you use an expert opinion, they your expert should have a title or credential of some sort that clearly indicates the expert's knowledge and experience in the topic. So if you're saying someone is an expert on, let's say, a certain drug, then you may want the doctor to be there to say, oh, well, amoxicillin really does have all these health benefits, and here are all the things that I can tell you about that. You want a doctor. You want him to be able to show he's got a degree in medicine. You don't want it to be just someone that comes on and says, oh yeah, I've given my kid Amoxil several times and my kid always gets better after a cold. That's not what you want. You want someone who's got verifiable credentials to be an expert. Now, we've looked at making claims using facts to support your thesis and using examples and expert opinions to back those up, but you can also look at emotional appeals. Opinions are formed by emotion as well as reason. So these are going to play more on reason, more on logic, where emotional appeals are going to pull on a reader's emotions. These should be used in a proper and ethical manner. And that's important to remember. If you're going to appeal to a reader's emotions, you need to be responsible about it and make sure you're doing it the right way. And let me show you some examples to expand on that. Think about drunk driving ads. Sometimes you may see some really sad and graphic things in those ads, but what's being shown is shown to you to let you know that this is a serious issue, that people should not drive after drinking because there can be terrible consequences. Anyone using that information should be using it to support not drinking and driving. And so even though it's pulling on your emotions, it's doing it for a good reason. But then let's look at politics. A lot of times, one candidate will put out an ad saying how patriotic they are, showing how they've served their country and all the ways they're patriotic. And that's really nice, but often it's going to also imply that the other candidate competing against the first one is not very patriotic, and that's usually far from the truth. Meanwhile, that first candidate's patriotism is going to link them to voters. Voters are going to say, oh, I really care about the country too, so I need to go with this guy because he's patriotic and the other one isn't, even though that's not true. So you don't want to mislead your audience with emotional appeals. And one other way that that can be done is with loaded language. If someone is extremely religious and they're called a fanatic, the word fanatic has a certain connotation to it that is negative. The same way if someone was environmentally conscious and someone called him a tree hugger, that has a negative connotation. So using loaded language words like that can give negative connotations and pull on a reader's emotions that way. And that's not what you want to do. You want to use it to support your argument, but not put down other things. So whenever you're writing a persuasive essay, make sure you're keeping in mind who your audience is, what their interests are, how much they may already know about the topic, and what's going to help them the most. And then you can decide if you want to use small claims along the way, expert opinions and examples, or emotional appeals to back up your thesis. But the most important thing you're going to need to do is to win your audience's trust. You want to establish that you're credible so that you can convince them that your opinion is the correct one.
Reading comprehension is extremely important. Oftentimes you'll be tested for what you read, so it's important that you understand what you are reading. I have some simple reading comprehension tips written up here on the board that I want to go over. The first is read when you are not tired. This is different times a day for different people, but for the most part this means do not read at night because you're going to be tired from the day's activity. Oftentimes people cannot read in the morning either because they are groggy from just having woken up. So make sure you read at a time when you are very alert. Read for short time intervals. Don't try to read for an hour or two at a time because you're going to get tired of reading and not retain what you read. Try to read for 30 to 45 minutes, take a break, and then read again. Read in a distraction-free environment. Get somewhere where your eyes and ears are not distracted. This means somewhere where there is not a lot of activity and where it is quiet so that you can solely focus on reading. Comprehend what you read. It's very easy to read a page and for your eyes to move down the page, but for your thoughts to be elsewhere. Stop and ask yourself as you are reading, what am I reading and why this is important?
because you wouldn't want to get to the end of a book and not have understood anything of the book and have to reread it. So make sure you're comprehending the book as you read it. Skim what you're about to read first. This means skimming the chapter, reading a title page, reading the preface and introduction, reading a chapter summary, and then reading the chapter in its entirety. Take advantage of the way a textbook is structured. Oftentimes, a textbook will have major headings, italicized words, and words in bold. These are important points that you should take note of. Oftentimes, chapters will have a list of important points at the end and a chapter summary. Read those as well, as those re-emphasize the important points of the chapter. So next time you read, remember these reading comprehension tips so that you can retain more of what you read.
Validity, reliability, and relevance of primary and secondary sources. Research papers depend on information taken from primary and secondary sources, and it's important that that information be valid, reliable, and relevant. So let's talk about sources. Primary sources are derived directly from the topic with no intermediation. Some examples would be diaries, eyewitness accounts, videos, letters, legislative documents, and experimental data. All of these things are first-hand accounts or evidence of what happened, and they're derived directly from the topic. There's nothing between that source and what you're reading. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are going to be commentaries or interpretations of primary sources. They're secondary. They take one of these things and then they comment on it or interpret it. So examples would be books and articles of history and literary criticism. If you have books or articles that are written about history, or you've got a literary criticism, something criticizing some other work of literature, they are commenting or interpreting a primary source, which makes it a secondary source. And they can still be sources that are good for your research paper, but you have to make sure that they fit these criteria. Your sources need to be valid, reliable, and relevant. You may find an amazing source. You may find a diary that you think is so cool and you want to include it in your paper, but if it's not valid, reliable, and relevant, then you shouldn't use that source. So let's talk about what each one of these means. Validity is indicated by the extent to which it is confirmed and echoed in other works. So a source could be valid if it's confirmed and echoed in other works. That means other works on the same topic that you're working on have cited that source. So if you're using something and you look it up and you see that it's been cited in lots of other papers, then that means that it's a pretty valid source, and that would be a good one to use. So you could check off validity. Next, you need to look at reliability. How reliable is your source? And that means that the source must consistently support your point to be reliable. If you have a topic and your source supports the topic and then gives a counter argument and goes back and forth and compares and contrasts why your idea or your topic is good or bad, that's not reliable. You want it to constantly, consistently support your point. You don't want it to waver back and forth. You don't want it to give any other option. You only want it to support your point if you're going to use it as a source. Now, in your writing, you can definitely go back and forth on a point. But if you're using a source in your research paper, it needs to be reliable. It needs to only back up your point and not give any other options. So if that happens, you can say, okay, it's reliable. I can use this source. Now let's look at relevance. In order to be able to use it, it's got to be valid, reliable, and relevant. So we've got to make sure it's relevant. And relevance refers to the extent to which the source applies to your essay. So if you're writing an essay about World War II and you find an amazing diary that was written by a slave during Civil War times, you shouldn't use it because it isn't relevant. It doesn't apply to your essay. It may be a really awesome book that you read, or whatever format the diary was in. You may think, this is so amazing, I want to use it in something, but you can't use it in your current work about World War II because it isn't fit in. It's not relevant. It doesn't apply to your essay. Even though they may both refer to war times, it's not referring to the correct war. So you have to make sure that your paper is going to only reflect sources that are relevant. So if you find a source and you can check that it's been used in other sources, it's valid, that it consistently supports your point, it's reliable, and that it applies to something in your essay, so it's relevant, then you can use that source. Otherwise, you should probably look for better sources and leave any that don't fit any one of these criteria behind and try not to use them. If you find something and you think, oh, it's reliable, it constantly is supporting my point, ooh, it's relevant, it definitely has to do with my paper, but it isn't valid, you can't find it cited anywhere else, you might not want to use that source because it may not be a valid source. It could be something that someone wrote without any information to back it up. It could just be something they wrote on the internet and you found it and it worked for your paper, but if it's not valid, it's not going to be a good source. So, when writing research papers, make sure that you are finding sources, both primary and secondary, that are valid, reliable, and relevant.
Readers must always be conscious of the difference between a fact and an opinion. So first we need to define what a fact and what an opinion is. So a fact can be proved or disproved. In other words, a fact can be subjected to analysis. However, an opinion cannot be subjected to an analysis. An opinion may not be alterable by research because an opinion is just the author's personal feelings. So this sentence right here says the distance from New York to Boston is about 200 miles. So this right here is a fact because this can be proven or disproven. Now, although this isn't very specific because it uses the word about, it still is a fact. You could look at a map and see that the distance from New York to Boston is about 200 miles. Now, the sentence New York is too crowded is stated almost like a fact, but it is still an opinion because there is no objective way to measure overcrowding. And so many times an opinion will be indicated by words like believe, think, or feel. Now, in this case, New York is too crowded. We don't see any of those words, so it's stated like a fact, but you have to, as a reader, have to evaluate this sentence and realize that this cannot be proved or disproved. You have to realize that it's just the author's personal feelings. Now, many times, an opinion will be supported by facts. So an example would be the author gives the population density of New York as a reason for why it is overcrowded. And now an opinion supported by facts tends to be more convincing. However, that doesn't make it a fact even though the writer might back it up with a fact. It's still an opinion. It's still the author's personal feelings. Now, like I said, an opinion supported by a fact tends to be more convincing. But when authors support their opinions with other opinions, the reader is unlikely to be moved. We could place the term false analogy into a group called a logical fallacy, which is a failure of reasoning. And so as a reader, it is important to recognize logical fallacies because they diminish the value of the author's message. So like I said, a false analogy is a logical fallacy. And so we could also call a false analogy a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, it is when the author suggests that two things are similar when in fact they are different. So basically, a false analogy is a false comparison. So many times an author uses a false analogy when they're trying to convince the reader that something unknown is like something familiar. So the author is taking something unknown to the reader and comparing it to something familiar. Now, here, the author is taking advantage of the reader's ignorance. Because like I said, this is comparing something unknown with something familiar. So the reader is not familiar with this unknown thing that we're talking about. So because of that, the author is able to take advantage of the reader's ignorance. So an example of a false analogy would be this statement right here. Failing to tip a waitress is like stealing money out of somebody's wallet. Now, of course, failing to tip is very rude, especially when the service has been good. But people are not arrested for failing to tip as they would be for stealing money from a wallet. So to compare stingy diners with thieves is a false analogy. False dichotomy is an example of a logical fallacy, which is a failure of reasoning. And that's just what false dichotomy is, a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we can define false dichotomy as when the author creates an artificial sense that there are only two possible alternatives in a situation. And by doing that, the author limits both the reader's options and imagination. And so this fallacy is common when the author has an agenda and wants to give the impression that their view is the only sensible one. And so readers should always be suspicious of the false dichotomy. When an author limits alternatives, the reader must ask, is the author being valid? Now, an example of false dichotomy is, you need to go to the party with me, otherwise you'll just be bored at home. And so here, the speaker suggests that the only other possibility besides being at the party is being bored at home. This is not true, as it is perfectly possible to be entertained at home, or even to go somewhere other than the party. And so this is an example of false dichotomy, because here the author is creating that artificial sense that there are only two possible alternatives. One is to go to the party, and one is to be bored at home. And remember that I said the author wants to give the impression that their view is the only sensible one. And so here, the only sensible option looks like to go to the party, because who wants to be bored at home? Whereas really, there's many options, and there's many sensible options in this situation. So that's why this is an example of false dichotomy. An overgeneralization is a type of logical fallacy, which is a failure of reasoning. And so that is what an overgeneralization is, a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we could define it as when an author makes a claim that is so broad it cannot be proved or disproved. So when an author uses an overgeneralization, it's usually to accomplish one of two motives. The first is to create an illusion of authority. So the author may want to make it look like they have authority when in fact they do not. The second possible motive is to sway the opinion of the reader. Usually, this would be accomplished by using sensational language. And so if the author was writing a persuasive essay, he may employ the use of overgeneralization to sway the opinion of the reader. Now, take a look at this example right here of overgeneralization. Everybody knows she is a terrible teacher. Now here, the author makes an assumption that cannot really be believed. It may be that most people do indeed have a negative view of the teacher, but to say that everybody feels that way is an exaggeration. Here, the author is claiming consensus when none actually exist. Now, when a reader spots an overgeneralization like this one, they should become skeptical about the argument that is being made, because an author will often try to hide a weak or unsupported assertion behind authoritative language. So if you see a statement like this and you can recognize it as an overgeneralization, know that that means that the author is probably trying to hide a weak or unsupported assertion behind authoritative language.
Today we're going to briefly go over types of pre-reading skills that can be taught to children. Before they even know how to start pronouncing whole words, understanding the meaning of those words as they see them printed, you can start to teach basic pre-reading skills as they look at printed material. Along with those things, you can help them practice recognizing individual letters. They've learned their ABCs, you can start helping them identify the sound that they've learned, or the word A, with what that represents and looks like in print. So part of pre-reading skills is then to help the child in identifying individual letters. And then to point out to them that those letters come in units called words. And words can be demarcated or shown to exist separate from each other because there's a blank space left between them. And if they've learned how to count, you can actually help them count the number of letters in a word. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and oh, look, there's a blank space. That's the end of that word. And then we skip over to a new word and we count the number of letters in that word. 1, 2, 3, skip space. So basically you're teaching them what to recognize in printed material without actually teaching them how to read yet, but to learn some of the things that we just take for granted. So that there is meaning in words. Words together have meaning called a sentence. Sentences together have meaning called a paragraph, and paragraphs have meaning when they're put together in a full story. And you can start to help them see this in printed material. Look, here's an individual word. Here's a group of words. How do I know when those words end? Well, look, here's punctuation. Here's a period, a question mark, an exclamation point. That lets you know that that group of words or sentence is at an end, and now we begin a new group of words or sentence. And then you can even show them paragraph structure. Look, all these sentences here are a unit. How can I tell? Well, look, it's separated from that unit and from this unit by a space, a clear line all the way across, and is indented in the first word. And these sorts of things can be taught structurally to those prior to learning how to actually read. And they can actually begin to incorporate this visual information before they even know how to put sounds to letters fully to form words, to form sentences, to understand the meaning. You can teach them the basics of looking at printed material in many different formats. So just basically, if they've learned their ABCs, you can spend time in recognizing individual letters. What letter is that? If they've learned how to count, then you can get them to count the number of letters in a word. The reason you do that is you're practicing, here's where the word ends. Look, there's a blank spot. Count the number of letters there. Then once you've taught them how to recognize a word, you can get them to count the number of words in a sentence because you've said, this is an individual word, individual word, individual word. Here's the period, exclamation point, or question mark at the end, so we know that's the ending point. Let's count the number of words together in this sentence. And so they've learned punctuation, they've learned how to differentiate words because of the space in between them. They've learned how to count individual letters and therefore recognize individual word units. All of these things can be helpful skills to learn prior to learning how to read. Well, this has just been a basic overview then of some pre-reading skills that can be taught to children. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll find a link.
When a writer appeals to the emotions of a reader, it's for the purpose of either persuading the reader or distracting the reader from the weakness of an argument. So in order to appeal to the reader's emotions, there's 4 main tactics a writer may use. The first is pity. The writer may try to get the reader to pity the writer. This may be through the sharing of a personal story that would evoke strong emotions on the part of the reader. The second tactic is the bandwagon approach. You may have heard the saying, jump on the bandwagon, and that's because the bandwagon is considered what everyone else is doing. Like a majority of people are doing something, so because everyone else is doing it, you should do it too. So that's the second tactic. The third tactic is the use of insults against counter-arguments. So instead of a writer necessarily talking about their own argument, they may just put down other arguments to show their argument as the best option. Then the fourth tactic is testimonials. This is often through the use of getting someone famous to endorse a certain idea or product. So these 4 tactics right here are oftentimes effective. However, writers should not use them because whenever they use these types of tactics, it's generally because they have a weak argument and they're having trouble persuading the reader. So whenever you notice noticing an author's position is very vital to understanding a piece of writing, because every writer is going to have a personal bias, or they're going to have a certain position on whatever they're writing about. So the way they portray something in their writing may not be totally accurate. So it's vital that you as a reader understand the author's position so you can better understand their work of writing. So first of all, the author's position is basically their stance on the issue at hand. It's what they believe about the issue they are writing about. So to help you find the author's position, you need to notice several things. Notice each point here starts with the word notice, because to find the author's position, you can't just sit back and have it come to you. You as the reader are going to have to be proactive and notice these things. So first of all, notice personal opinions. So this is basically noticing when someone is interjecting their own thoughts about something instead of actually putting fact in there. Notice bias. This is when someone words a sentence or a paragraph so that they portray something as being good or maybe portray something else as being bad. In other words, they're not giving fact anymore. The way they word something casts something into a negative light or makes something look very good or very positive. Also, notice emotional language. This is when a writer puts their own thoughts into something or their own opinions into something, and then by using strong emotional language, tries to sway the reader over to their thinking. Now remember, again, we're not talking about a persuasive paper, because persuasive papers are always going to have a certain author's position in it, because that's the idea of a persuasive paper, that the author is trying to sway you a certain way. So we're not focusing on persuasive papers, focusing on other kinds of papers when the author really isn't supposed to have a bias, when they're not supposed to have a position on the issue. But nevertheless, they are going to have a position. And so sometimes they'll insert emotional language to try to persuade someone to their thinking. Then also, notice what information is left out. Because when we're talking about personal opinions, bias, and emotional language, these are all things that are going to be added to the paper. This is something an author may add to the paper to insert their bias or to insert their own position. But noticing what is left out is when the author doesn't write something to support their position. This may be some fact that would look bad upon their own position, so they just leave it out. So sometimes it's hard to know what is left out because it's not there. And if you don't know anything else about the topic at hand, you may not know what pertinent information is being left out. But sometimes that can be helpful to understanding the author's position. So the important thing to take away from this is that the author's position is their stance on the issue at hand. In any piece of writing that is out there, the author who wrote it is going to have a position on that subject. So it's up to you as the reader to determine how strong that position is portrayed in the paper, and to notice anytime anything is skewed or the facts are twisted a little bit, and when the author is trying to persuade you to believe like they do. When a reader comes across an unfamiliar word, it's important that they know techniques to understanding the word's definition. One way to determine a word's definition is by looking at the prefix and suffix of the word. Although there are many words in the English language, many of those words share a common prefix or suffix. So by understanding the meaning of that prefix or suffix, the reader can then determine the likely meaning of the word. So one way to determine word meaning is structural analysis, and that's by looking at the prefix, the root, and the suffix, all of a word. So take the word unacceptable, for example. Here you have the root word, accept. Because that can be a word in itself. And then here you have the prefix, un, and the suffix able. The prefix is always going to come before the root word, and the suffix is always going to come after the root word. Now, notice I said the root word is the word that can stand alone. I understand that able can also stand alone and is a word, but in this case it's a suffix. So if you saw un or able written by themselves, you would see it written like this. That's because the dash
represents the word. So here, since un is a prefix, the word comes after the prefix. And here with able, the word comes before able because able is the suffix. So say you didn't understand what unacceptable meant. Well, you could look at able, and you know that means able pretty much. And so you know acceptable must mean able to accept. Well, un, you know, means not so from words like unprofessional, because unprofessional means not professional. It means the opposite of. So you know that un means not acceptable. It's something that's not able to be accepted. So thereby using the prefix and the suffix of the word and knowing the meanings of those, the reader can determine the meaning of the word unacceptable. Now some words like backward don't have both a prefix and a suffix. They just have a suffix. So back is this, the root word, and word is the suffix. So say you didn't know what backward meant, but you knew what the root word meant. You knew what back meant. But you remember the word toward, which also has the same suffix. And you know that means going somewhere. So you could get an idea that this suffix has something to do with direction. So since you see the root word back, you know it means going back to. And so that's another example of how to use the prefix or the suffix to determine the meaning of the word. And some words just have a prefix. This word, for example, has a prefix and a suffix, but no root word. Here, bio is a prefix, and ology is also a suffix. And they share that O. And so you could look at this and think, okay, I don't know what this means, but I know I've seen the word bio before and the word biography. Well, that's a book about someone's life. So bio must mean life. And then what does ology mean? Well, I've heard of archaeology, and so that must mean the study of something because you're studying something. So ology means the study of. So by knowing the prefix and the suffix and what they mean of this word, you can conclude that this word most likely means the study of life. So it's important to understand common prefixes and suffixes so that you can determine the meaning of an unfamiliar word. Every piece of writing should have a logical conclusion, and it's your job as the reader to identify that conclusion, mainly for the purpose of helping you to understand whether you agree with the writer or not. Because you don't want to just read a piece of literature, you want to analyze it. So one step in that process to better understanding it is identifying the conclusion to know whether you agree with the writer or not. So now I want to talk about how to identify that conclusion. So you're going to need to infer a lot, or make an inference. And to infer something just means to take what you already know and combine it with something else to draw a conclusion. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to combine two things. What you already know with the info or the information found in the text. So I'm going to draw a double arrow there because to make an inference, you're pulling these two things together, everything you find in the text, any pre-knowledge you have, and you're pulling that together to draw the conclusion. And generally, a conclusion should be obvious. If a writer does a good job in their writing, then the conclusion should be easily identifiable. Otherwise, you may draw a conclusion that is not the conclusion the writer had in mind. But nevertheless, it's important that you as the reader analyze the writing and identify the logical conclusion. An inference is a piece of information that is implied, not stated. So basically, readers are often required to understand text that claims and suggests ideas without stating them directly. So that's why it's important for readers to understand inferences and how they can be drawn out of a passage. So take a look at this example. Mark made more money that week than he had in the previous year. So there's two possible inferences that a reader could make from this passage. They could infer that the reader made lots of money that week, so much so that they made more in the previous year. So the one thing they could infer is that there was lots of money this week. The other thing they could infer is that there was little money in the previous year. So I hope you see the contrast here. Either there was lots of money made that week, or there was just little money made in the previous year. So those are two possible inferences that the reader could make. The second is, when his coffee arrived, he looked around the table for the silver cup. So here the reader has to infer that the silver cup contains creamer for the coffee. So that's one thing the reader can infer. And from that, the reader can draw that the subject of the sentence, he, always drinks his coffee with creamer. So this sentence right here may not be important to the passage as a whole, but sometimes it's important that the reader infer something so that they can understand the entire passage. A prediction is a guess about what will happen next. So when a reader actively engages in whatever they are reading, they naturally make predictions about what will happen next. And they base these predictions off of what they have read, and what they already know. So by taking what they have read and what they already know, a reader can formulate what they think will happen next in the story. So consider this sentence. Staring at the computer screen in shock, Kim blindly reached over for the brimming glass of water on the shelf to her side. So the reader is naturally going to read this and have an idea of what is going to happen next. And the reader will probably notice the word blindly. So Kim is so caught up in what's happening on the computer, she goes for a drink of water, but since she's caught up on what's going on the computer, she reaches over without really looking at the glass of water to grab it. So the reader is going to assume that she's going to knock over the glass of water. Now, that may not be what happens, but still it's a prediction either way. The prediction may come true, and a prediction may not come true. But a reader is naturally going to make predictions about a passage, and it's making predictions is part of being actively engaged in what the reader is reading. The purpose of an author is basically why the writer wrote the paper. It's what motivated them to write something. So there's three basic types of motivations or purposes of an author. They either wrote something to inform, entertain, or persuade. So it's important as a reader to understand the purpose of the author because it helps you better understand the text. So generally, it's pretty easy to determine what type of paper something is. So an informative paper is basically when the reader or the writer is just giving the reader facts about something. They're telling them more about something. A paper that is meant to entertain is generally fiction. It's pretty much any kind of fiction work is meant to entertain. Now occasionally fiction will serve a double purpose of also trying to inform, trying to persuade. But generally when something's meant to entertain, generally means that it's some kind of fiction piece. Then finally, the third type, or the third purpose, is to persuade. And this is actually the hardest type to determine because generally, an author is going to try to hide that they're trying to persuade you. Because when someone knows they're trying to be persuaded, they're going to be wary or skeptical of the arguments that the writer is throwing at them. So a lot of times a writer will try to disguise their persuasive paper as a paper that's meant to inform or a paper that's meant to entertain, but actually it's meant to persuade the reader. So those are the three main types of purposes of an author: to inform, to entertain, or to persuade. A sequence is the order in which things happen. So it's important that a reader be able to identify the sequence so they can follow along with what is happening in the passage. So a sequence is basically the order in which things happen, or the order of events. To help spot the sequence in a passage, you can look for words like first, then, last, and next. So if you find these words in a passage or other words like it, you'll know that that's showing you some part of the sequence. And so that helps you determine what happened first, then next, and then last. And finally, most sequences will be in chronological order. Basically, chronological means based on time. So if I was talking about my day, I would say, okay, at 7 o'clock I got up, at 7:30 I ate breakfast, at 8 o'clock I went for a run, and then at 12 o'clock I ate lunch. See, that's chronological. It's proceeding through time. Now, some texts might not be in chronological order, and so those can be more confusing when trying to find the sequence. However, sometimes that's the best way to go about writing certain passages, so just understand that not all passages will be in chronological order, but nevertheless, it's important that you understand the sequence of events. So to practice, take a look at this sentence. He walked in the front door and switched on the hall lamp. Notice here that none of these words are present in this passage. However, you can still find what the sequence is here. So you know that he must have walked in the front door first and then switched on the light bulb. That had to have happened second, because first he had to get inside the door. So this may seem like a very simple and elementary example, but it's still important to be able to identify the sequence in a passage or sentence. There's many instances when it's important to understand a sequence of events, but sometimes you're not sure what one of those events was. And so maybe you're reading a story and you have to look at the context and make a conclusion about what you think happened. So take a look at this story right here. Emily went to the store to buy eggs for her mother. So she bought the eggs and got on her bicycle to bring the eggs home. Her mother was angry that the eggs were all broken. So we see a sequence of 3 events here. The first start of the story being that she buys eggs and then gets on her bicycle. And then the last part of the story being her eggs were broken when she arrived at home, because it says her mother was angry that the eggs were broken. So we're missing point number 2 here, because we have to know, why are the eggs broken? What happened between the point that she got on her bicycle to leave the store and when she arrived at home? Now, there is a possibility that the eggs were already broken when she bought them, but we're going to conclude that Emily checked on that and that she would not have bought eggs that were already broken. And so we have to assume that Emily either fell off her bicycle or dropped the eggs on the way home. However, we're not given any information on how the eggs were broken. We just know that they are broken, or ended up being broken. So for point number 2, we're going to keep it kind of general and just say the eggs were broken on the way home. So in this case, we just have to look at the story, evaluate the context of it, and then just make a logical conclusion for what we think happened. When it comes to summarizing text, you need to be able to state the main point of a story. So a summary is just stating the main point of a story. So you're reading an entire story, and then you're just taking the important things and writing about that. If you've ever looked at the back of a book, you'll see a summary on the back of a book. And so there's a whole book that may be 100 or 200 pages, but the author summarizes it on the back of the book so that you get an idea of what it's about. So that's what you're trying to do through a summary. So there's 4 main points that you should remember when writing a summary. Focus, like I already said, on the main idea of the story. Focus on the key points. In other words, you're not worried about little details. You're worried about the important things that contribute to the overall storyline. The third point is focus on the conclusion of a story. Because in most stories, there's some kind of problem. The whole plot is based around some kind of problem throughout the story. Then eventually that problem is resolved. And so that happens in the conclusion of the story. So look at the conclusion of the story and talk about that too in your summary. So you're going to be talking about the main idea of the story, the key points, the problem, maybe a little bit about the main character, and then talk about the end of the story and how the character ended up dealing with his or her problem. And then the fourth point is kind of a longer one. Focus on important information the author wants the reader to know. So throughout the story, you may notice certain points that the author really wants the reader to understand. And so look for that important information and include that in the summary as well. And so a summary is typically 1 paragraph in length.
So it's not very long because it does not need to be long because you're not focusing on details, you're just focusing on the overall story. And so remember, again, you're looking for important information. And so we're not interested in details. Try not to even think about the details, just look for the main idea of the story. Now, in some cases, you might be writing a summary for a long story with multiple settings and scenes. And so a summary may be a few paragraphs in length, and these paragraphs give the main points of each major part of the story. And so the summary of a long story always includes a conclusion to wrap up the story as an entirety. So like I said, the summary is usually going to be one paragraph, but if it's a really long story that has lots of different settings, lots of different scenes, lots of different problems throughout the plot, you may need to write a paragraph for each main point or major part of the story. And then for that summary, you're going to write a few paragraphs, and then you're going to write a conclusion that's going to kind of summarize that whole story. And so only make a summary longer than one paragraph if you feel like you cannot include all the important information in one paragraph. So again, a summary states the main point of a story. Supporting details are very important parts of a paper. It can be said that the topic and main idea of a paper is the most important part. But without supporting details, main ideas and topics are irrelevant. So basically, supporting details reinforce a larger point. So a writer will make a point which may take the form of a topic or a main idea of a paper. So the writer makes that point, and then the writer backs up their point with supporting details. And these details are most often found in informative and persuasive text. And this makes sense because if the writer is telling you about something, each main point they make, they're also going to need to back up with more points so that the reader can be sure that they are being told accurate information. Then also in a persuasive text, if the writer is trying to get the reader to do something or to think a certain way, the writer can't just make a bunch of points. They're going to have to back up those points so that the reader will indeed think that way or take that action that the writer wants them to take. And supporting details are often easy to spot because the writer will let you know that those details are coming. A lot of times they'll make a main point and then they'll say something like first, and they'll make us give a supporting detail and second, and give another supporting detail and then say finally, and then give the third supporting detail. Or they might say something like for example or for instance, and that would tip you off that the next supporting detail is coming along. Supporting details need to be two things. They need to be both factual and relevant. Because if something is totally accurate and factual, but it's not relevant to the main idea, then it's no good. The supporting detail needs to be accurate and needs to relate back to the main idea. And if a supporting detail is very relevant, if it pertains to the main idea, but is not accurate, then again, it's no good because what good is information that is not true? So the important thing to remember with supporting details is that basically their job is to reinforce a larger point, and they can be most often found in informative and persuasive text. They're often easy to spot because they're preceded by words like first, second, finally, or for instance, or for example. And the most important thing for details to be is both factual and relevant. A table of contents can be very helpful for you as the reader to find what you're looking for in a book or any type of publication. Almost any type of publication is going to have a table of contents, so you can count on being able to use one. Table of contents are usually structured like this. First, it'll have any introductory information at the top, like the preface and the introduction. That'll be on the left side. Then on the right side, I'll have the page numbers. But with the preface and introduction, many times it'll have it in Roman numerals. So I'll put I here and then IV right there for page 4. And once you get to the actual meat of the book, the chapters, you're going to have page numbers there. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 and so on and so forth. Sometimes they'll actually have the name of the chapter, like this chapter had a title. Then the name would be right there. And so for chapter 1, we'll put
page 1, and then for chapter 2, we'll put page 17. So this is what a table of contents would look like, with the introductory material at the top, generally with Roman numerals, and then the meat of the book in the middle, in chronological order as you move throughout the book, chapter 1 coming first, and chapter 2 all the way throughout the book, with the page numbers over here. So table of contents can be very helpful, so be sure to use them. A theme is basically an issue, an idea, or a question raised in a text. This is different than a topic or a main idea. So a theme might be something like love or triumphed over difficult circumstances. So you might think of a topic or a main idea as what the whole paper is about, but a theme is something that's reoccurring throughout the entire book. So maybe you've been to a party before. Well, the topic of the party might have been so-and-so's 25th birthday party, but the theme of the party might have been a circus theme. So notice there that the topic of the party wasn't circus, but the theme was. So in the same way, that's kind of what a theme is. It's kind of the underlying topic of the entire paper. So there can be more than one theme in a paper. That's common. And oftentimes a theme will raise more questions than it answers. It'll really get the reader thinking, and it won't resolve all of the issues that the theme raises throughout the entire story. And then you can find the theme by looking at issues the text is addressing. So again, it's not the topic, but it's issues and things that come up in the book or the story repeatedly. Those are the themes of the paper. And generally, there'll be something to back up a theme. Like if you were going to write a paper about the theme in another paper, you wouldn't just say, this is the theme because I think it's the theme. Anytime there's a theme in the paper, you should be able to find lots of backup data that would support the fact that that is a theme in the paper. Because it's something that's reoccurring throughout the entire text. Topics and main ideas are vital parts of a paper. So it's important that you know how to find the topic and main ideas. But first, we need to understand what those are. So a topic is a subject of a text. Basically, it's what the text is about. And the main idea is the most important point being made. So every paper includes a main idea and a topic. And every paragraph also includes a main idea and a topic. So a topic is very general. A topic is not specific at all. It just tells an overview of what the paper or the paragraph is about. So the topic of a paper could just be tennis. That's the subject of the text, or the text is about tennis. But the main idea is more specific. The main idea is like a thesis statement. It's the most important point being made in the paper. So while the topic might be tennis, the main idea would be tennis is a good form of exercise. So generally you can find the topic and main idea in the first sentence of the paper. So it might say something like, tennis is a great form of exercise. So you know there, the topic's tennis, and the main idea is exercise. Or this might also be found at the beginning of a paragraph. If the paper is about something different, the paragraph may have its own topic and main idea. So the first sentence of the paragraph might be, tennis is a great form of exercise. And there, boom, you found the topic and the main idea. Some papers are more difficult and some paragraphs are more difficult, and you may have to read each sentence in that paper or paragraph and find the general theme of all those sentences, what those sentences have in common. But in general, it's very easy to find the topic. You can just scan the paper and figure out what the paper is about, and then more specifically, you can find out what the main idea of the paper is. And since the main idea is the main idea, it's the most important part of the paper, the main idea will be repeated oftentimes throughout the entire paper, generally in the introduction and in the conclusion, and sometimes in between. A description is a detailed record of the sensory perceptions of some person, place, or thing. In many cases, an author will seek to make a point through their description. So consider if a writer wrote about the way a rose smells, or the way hot pavement feels on bare feet, or the sound of your mother's voice. All of those would be forms of description.
And the reason all of those would be forms of description is because if a writer wrote about these things, then they would be providing a detailed record of the sensory perceptions of some person, place, or thing. So if a writer wrote about the way a rose smells, the writer would be talking about the sensory perception of smell to a person. Or if they wrote about the way hot pavement feels on bare feet, they'd be talking about the sensory perception of touch to to whoever has the bare feet. Or they might be talking about the sound of your mother's voice. They're talking about the sensory perception of hearing, and they're talking about that in terms of whoever is hearing their mother's voice. Now, sometimes an author will use short descriptions to give the reader a sense of the emotional content of the topic. Now, it's important as you're reading to evaluate the descriptive details the reader is using. So there's a couple of things you should look for when evaluating these details. One is you should make sure that the details advance the author's point. If the details aren't advancing the author's point, then they're irrelevant and they're cumbersome to the reader and they're distracting from the main point that the author is trying to make. And the descriptive details should also make the text more enjoyable. If the descriptive details don't make the text more enjoyable, then again, that means the facts are probably irrelevant or there's just too many of them, and so they're becoming cumbersome to the reader. And again, they're distracting from the author's main point. So you as the reader should be constantly evaluating whether the descriptive details included by the author advance the author's point and make the text more enjoyable, or if they are just distracting and irrelevant. The word narrative is a synonym for story. So when an author tells a story, he or she is engaging in narration. So there's a few reasons why an author tells a story. Two of the main ones are for, one, the entertainment value of the story, and another is to convey a larger point. So sometimes the reader is not worried about conveying a point, but they are just telling a story just for the purpose of the entertainment value of that story. And other times it's to convey a larger point to the reader. Now, as a reader, you should constantly evaluate the ways in which the author uses narration to accomplish his or her goals. Now, there's a couple of keys to the effective use of narration. One is the point of the story should be self-evident. It should be obvious to the reader why the author is telling that story. And then a second key is the author shouldn't include any unrelated or contradictory details. Anytime the author uses unrelated or contradictory details, it undermines his or her own agenda. And so those are a couple of things that you as a reader should be looking for to evaluate whether or not the writer used narration effectively. A text is said to be engaged in the rhetorical strategy of persuasion when it attempts to convince the reader of a certain fact or opinion through the use of reasoning. So the rhetorical strategy of persuasion is when the writer is trying to convince the reader through the use of reasoning. Now, there's a couple of criteria that an essay needs to meet in order to be an effective persuasive essay. So a writer needs to make sure they incorporate these two criteria into any persuasive essay they're writing. So the first one is an effective persuasive essay is somewhat objective. In addition to that, an effective persuasive essay favors one side of the argument. Now, you may be thinking that these are contradictory statements, but these two statements can coexist in an essay. Now, the reason a writer needs to be somewhat objective is that a persuasive essay that does not seriously and reasonably assess the arguments of the other side will not be able to convince an impartial and thoughtful reader. So that's why it's important to be somewhat objective. The essay can't be overly weighted to one side. The writer or the reader needs to feel that the writer weighed both sides of the argument and that they're giving facts from both sides of the argument. Now, in order to be a persuasive essay, however, the essay cannot be totally objective. It has to favor one side of the argument. Now, an informational essay could be totally objective, but in order to be a persuasive essay, the writer does need to favor one side of the argument. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the writer trying to push one side of the argument. It's just important that they're objective enough that they get some trust with the reader. Now, because the writer is trying to persuade the reader, it's very important in persuasive essays that the reader take care to separate matters of fact from matters of opinion. And so you're probably already familiar with this concept. A matter of fact would be, he was born in 1953. Now, a matter of opinion is, he was a nice man. So these are really very elementary examples of matters of fact and matters of opinion. But notice here, he was born in 1953 is a fact. This is undisputable. But he was a nice man is disputable. People have different ideas of what nice means, and they have a different idea of whether or not this person was a nice man. So it's important that you as a reader are distinguishing between the matters of fact that the writer uses and the matters of opinion that the writer uses, so that you as a reader are not being deceived by the writer.